Unlike our last sub-series of filler between main series that included the amazing story of Roxas in 358 over 2 days, and some other games I'd rather not remember, the gulf between 2 and 3 was actually pretty short, because the release schedule included Birth by Sleep and its sequel, and a bunch of mobile Facebook nonsense that I have no reason to legitimize as games, and also some of them have since shut down, so either way, the players are the losers. But at least we got something new to the 3DS out of this malarkey, Kingdom Hearts 3D. Which, stupid past me, forgot that I technically already owned since I bought the Story So Far collection before I bought a 3DS copy of this game. But enough about my problems, let's talk Keyblade Master Problems. Like other Kingdom Hearts games, the intro starts out sounding like it's gonna be sensible and have a straightforward journey sort of plot that doesn't go in 15 random directions, and then, once you hit the halfway point, you end up tripping over so many left turns that you can no longer find yourself on the plot map, even though you brought your Kingdom Hearts guaranteed plot compass with you. Stupid broken thing can't even find nobody north. Grumble, grumble, stupid frickin' eBay. Well, the game starts out with Sora and Riku being called into Yen's office like a grumpy principal from the elementary school that Sora should still be enrolled in. Yen has called them down to do something they probably should have done 2 games ago, their Keyblade Mastery exam. Except Yen decided to kick this up 4 notches in spite of there being no Keyblade Masters trained for like 20 years, and everyone's out of practice. In spite of these ridiculous hurdles, Yen's objective for the test sounds simple enough. The pair of them have to uncover the power of waking in order to be better prepared for their new abilities as masters and to fight more evil that's sure to be around the corner, because the previous events of the game have shown that when a heartless and a nobody of an important character are destroyed, the vessels can be fused together to recreate that lost person, which the pair have now managed with the destruction of Ansem and Xemnas. This is also the game that started putting time travel on the main stage, even though it always existed in the background through the introduction of young Xehanort as the central villain of this game. I had to Wikipedia this because introducing time travel to Kingdom Hearts is nearly impossible to follow, except for Reddit, which explained how this is supposed to work plot-wise. Apparently, young Xehanort was able to time travel back to pre-destroyed Destiny Islands to meet the robed figure, who is Ansem, and the robed figure decided to transfer his time travel abilities to young Xehanort so that he could continue his plan of putting together the new Organization 13. Back in not Crazy Land, in order to retrieve the power of waking, Yen commands the pair of them to begin seeking out the Sleeping Worlds, which are worlds that the darkness has already devoured, and they're still intact for some reason, just having been cut off from the normal pathways they've been using by doing dream drops. Something that totally wasn't made up on the spot so that they could have a 3D subtitle. Definitely, trust me on. At least, this means that we get into some brand new content for this game, unlike the DS games. Kingdom Hearts Recycling and Recycling 2: The Revenge. Beyond the plot curveballs and the usual moralistic nonsense this game throws to the franchise, the rest of the game is actually pretty standard Kingdom Hearts stuff. The characters go down to various Disneylands and get involved with the characters of that story, help them sort out the movie's plot, and then move on with very little being learned about their own objective. Maybe the main villain will show up for a minute or two, and that's probably because their objective was to go out and find more keyholes that'll unlock that power they're looking for some reason. What I really don't like about this game in particular is that since it is just generating so many new plot ideas this fast, that this game's place in the franchise is actually very confusing. 3D just has way too many connections to past events and trying to recontextualize the earlier games that it ends up just making it hard to connect the dots of this franchise together anymore. I can understand the bullet points that 3D is trying to go for, but when you start getting into the machinations of what young Xehanort manages to do to put together this new organization, it's just a head trip at the very least. Time travel was not a good idea to add to this plot pie, but it seems now that I'm writing this that it was just inevitable, since the timeline is so convoluted anyway, that this was the only explanation that they could have made work, and now my brain hurts like a goddamn jerk. But while my dealing with Dream Drop Distance is brain abuse, we do get to enjoy some sparkly, interesting new Disney content. This game comes in heavy with the Three Musketeers, a musical Fantasia level, and the famous/infamous Hunchback of Notre Dame level, which I'm surprised was only in this game, since it seems like the quintessential Disney movie alongside Mulan that didn't make the original cut. Just makes it all the more confusing that Nightmare Before Christmas was in the original run. While the DS games had to deal with not being able to deal with the hardware limitations well at all with their terrible graphics, level designs, and animation, 3D is the first one of these portable games that feels like a solid Kingdom Hearts game without making excuses. The levels looked great and they're just as flashy as their console counterparts. Not much was actually sacrificed to put the expected experience onto this platform, and it seems to be one of the few games in the franchise that stood to benefit from the hardware's 3D gimmick, because we aren't just looking at the adventures of Mario stuck on the 2D plane. The combat's a bit different this time around. In addition to your standard combo array, you also get the... well, I forgot what it's called, so I'll just call it the flow attack, which allows Sora to do Tony Hawk tricks in order to gain speed in flight, and then he can use that momentum to smash into enemies really hard. And it was a good gimmick, since it's easy to use without the attack getting cancelled halfway through, but it integrates into normal combat as well as the iron boots. It's because you have to break off from the combat to run around the room to build up momentum in order to smash enemies with it, so it's more useful as a movement tech, a puzzle solver, or a combat beginner. Otherwise, it just takes too long to set up for it to actually be useful during an encounter. What's more useful is the Pokemon gimmick that 3D has. With the introduction of Dream Eaters as this game's new Heartless, Sora is able to befriend the nice versions of the monsters to begin fighting on his side. You are allowed to do combo attacks with the Dream Eaters at points which are usually decent enough to be worth using, but otherwise, it's just good having AI allies around just to get in some free, simple hits. However, while the Dream Eaters were a nice idea in theory, in execution they almost killed the entire game, because the usual combo array from the main series ended up being locked behind specific Dream Eater skill trees. In order to unlock these skill trees, other than doing anything that would make sense, like tying it directly to leveling up in battle, you instead have to waste time playing pathetic mini-games focused on tapping the screen for a minute and a half, feeding them food over and over and over again, or tapping the screen again to pet them for a minute. The only solace you get in this whole nonsense is that on some level, the designers also thought that this progression system was stupid, so leveling up in the Pokemon minigames is ridiculously fast, if you have the resources to spend. The whole thing is still moronic to the nth degree, because this pet sitting nonsense is the only way to get the actual tech you need to beat the game, like Leaf Bracer and the magic buffs, and you have to spend time experimenting with creating new Dream Eaters and training them in order to locate which Dream Eater has the skill you're actually looking for on its tree, and there are quite a few Dream Eaters in the game. I think by the end I had about 20 to 30 recipes for different Dream Eaters in my menu. It's extensive, which would have been a nice addition if it naturally progressed with your regular experience, instead of being a self-contained system that serves as a perpetual distraction from playing the actual game. Like, what the fuck is even going on here? I would believe that this was a good idea if it wasn't so asinine and boring. I don't think that the Sonic Cow Garden locked this shit behind pet sitting, but I might be misremembering. Whatever, I hate this no matter what. Let's move on. The best new thing that was added to this game was the simple fact of putting Riku into the main character role like they should have done immediately after Kingdom Hearts, because Riku is the better character, no contest against Sora. But for whatever reason, it seems like Kingdom Hearts writers have lost confidence in his arc. Riku has had so much potential with his past experience in the darkness to get a new coming into his own as a hero story and overcome a harder challenge, a bigger temptation. But for the most part, it seems like Riku is just prattling around the world simply trying to do his job. He doesn't get into the problems of the world's characters because their problems aren't a part of his quest. Riku just does what he needs to, and he's not acting like he's haunted by the issues of the world, or his past, or the rising danger of the new villain. Riku doesn't get fazed by anything, so when he starts confronting the new villains on his quest, he doesn't take their taunts seriously, and so their impact on him is incredibly minimal. They're just visiting for a minute or two, they say things that he doesn't believe in, so the whole idea doesn't go anywhere. Riku just doesn't get much good development as the game goes on, so his side of the game feels like he's there just to get his job done, and if he happens to confront his inner darkness again, then he'll just conquer it in another round because he's completely unflappable. Whereas on the other side, Sora ends up being personally invested mostly because he's a freaking buffoon. By the end of 3D, Sora is the one who's in peril, and Riku manages to use his higher talent and ability to save him from the evil just to underline his role in this entire story. He's scared by what young Xehanort is doing by throwing out nightmare creatures on the sleeping worlds in order to harm his instant friends, and as such, he decides to fight all the monsters threatening his friends just to be everybody's savior, and then in the process he'll continue on his quest. His secondary focus on the Power of Waking quest is why he keeps getting sidetracked dealing with other people's problems. Unlike Riku, who is the exact opposite. He solves the world's problems as an incidental thing to actually finding the keyhole. It's a thing that he's required to do just to keep moving the story forward. The major addition to the gameplay in 3D, since they went for this two protagonist concept, is the ability to drop in and out between the two stories. Because since this is a mastery test, or maybe because the original drop into the sleeping worlds didn't go so well, Sora and Riku ended up being in separate timelines of their sleeping worlds. It's not a huge difference in time, and the major difference is that the group of characters gets split up like the Twary gang, so narratively, the two of them can't affect the timeline that the other character is in, but they can see each other through temporal echoes, kind of like how Dark Souls does this sort of shtick. Gameplay-wise, this means that the game has a button that allows you to switch between both characters whenever you feel like it, but that's not all, folks, and it's yet another huge problem that wrecks the game on a fundamental level. Instead of the drop-in mechanic being a pure player choice idea, the drop-in mechanic is on a timer through most of the game, only giving you a limited amount of time to play as that character before the game automatically drops you into the other character. There is a common item in the game that allows you to extend the timer called Drop Me Nots, but just that existing is not an excuse for how awkward and annoying this auto drop-in mechanic actually works. Why should I have to use an item continually throughout the game just to continue playing as a character to finish off a level and then move on with the other character? It just doesn't make sense that 3D has an auto dropout in the first place. And it wouldn't be such an irritation if the game just had perfect dropouts that would put the other characters on a save state so you could pick up exactly where you left off. And no, it's based on checkpoints. A bunch of times I got hit with the auto dropout was obviously the end of a level, because I don't want to finish levels halfway and then switch to a different one altogether. I want to go the whole way to feel like I'm making some real progress. So what would happen is what would be the most likely time to get hit by an auto dropout would be the time that I'm dealing with the level's boss. And if you drop out during a boss fight, you have to return and then do the entire boss fight over again. I don't have to tell you how infuriating it is to have to repeat a boss fight from scratch when you end up getting dropped while they're at less than 10% health. It's a mechanic that's so anti-player choice that I don't even know why 3D has it at all. Its inclusion just doesn't make sense. As the game continues, young Xehanort doesn't seem particularly interested with dealing with Sora and Riku's mastery exam, and is just focused on finding old villains of the timeline for an unknown reason. It's why Sora and Riku end up running into people like Ansem and Xemnas, in spite of them already having been defeated. If Xehanort is teaming up with the future versions of himself, then the Keyblade Masters have a huge problem on their hands. Fortunately for them, in the meantime, their hands-off approach means that the threats in the Disney worlds are actually comparatively minor, allowing them to more easily find the sleeping keyholes just because they're not getting messed around with constantly. However, once they're actually done, the journey is still not complete, as the pair are then drawn to the final world, Nobody City. It's here where everything finally comes together, and we learn what the Mastery Exam was all about as Xigbar joins the party. Having been revived to join the new Organization 13, we learn what young Xehanort has been doing this entire time, going along his destined path to make sure that all the events that trigger his planned future are in place, so that future Xehanorts can use his time travel ability to come to this specific point in time in order to fill out the ranks of this organization. The original Organization 13 was supposed to be the new organization, but they ended up being so cocky, dead-eyed, and functionally useless that it was never going to happen, using their nobodies as vessels to hold on to different parts of the alternate Xehanort's hearts. Now, they need new vessels, which is where Sora comes in. Apparently, in spite of them getting the objective from Yen Sid, this entire Mark of Mastery exam ended up being the perfect ruse that young Xehanort hijacked in order to gain their final objective, capturing Sora in total darkness to use him as their final vessel. In order to do this, the new organization has been taunting Sora in order to deceive him into diving deeper and deeper into each new sleeping world, eventually leading him to the bowels of Nobody City, which put him at the deepest point he'd ever dived down. And on top of that, at the beginning of their journey, Sora had to fall into a deep dream anyway in order to search for the sleeping keyholes, putting him in the most vulnerable state that he could be, filled with the last part of Xehanort's heart and being consumed by the darkness. After being tired from fighting Xemnas and Xigbar, that is when they strike and drown him into that state when he can become the new vessel. On the flip side, the reason why Sora and Riku have been separated for this entire journey is that once Sora fell into his deep sleep, Riku had ended up diving into Sora's dream in order to protect Sora from the darknesses that were following him throughout the journey. Riku was acting as a dream eater for Sora, and along the way his personal journey led him to confronting more of his inner darkness that was threatening to consume him once again. Instead of locking it away forever, Riku attempts to defeat his inner darkness in order to use its abilities to fight for the light, which should theoretically give him that power without the corrupting influence. Once that's been conquered and Ansem has been defeated from his heart, young Xehanort has finally been bested by Riku. On top of that, the final plot point falls into place and the real Xehanort finally makes his destined appearance to lead the copies of himself. The entire point of Kingdom Hearts 3D was exactly what it seemed back at the end of Notre Dame. It's all preparation for Kingdom Hearts 3, setting up the pieces of destiny through this time travel nonsense to acquire a team of his 13 Darknesses. Destiny says that when the 7 Guardians and the 13 Seekers clash, their confrontation will manage to create another Chi Blade, the artifact that will allow its user to open the real Kingdom Hearts, which was lost to darkness ages ago. Now that he has Sora under his thumb, Xehanort's team is complete and the Guardians are now on the back foot. That is, until someone makes their cameo appearance. Lee shows up at the perfect time, like always, to grab Sora and book it for the hills, trying to fix this whole dreaming nonsense. I'm sure Xehanort doesn't consider it a loss, since he's betting on destiny to work itself out, so that he can have his vessels and his opponents, since the Chi Blade is the only thing he's looking for. The game finishes by telling us that Riku managed to complete his Mastery Exam test, and he has found the power of waking, which is the ability that allowed him to dive into Sora's dream in the first place. Now he has to do it again to save Sora from his perpetual sleep. Diving deep into Sora's dream leads him to fight the being corrupting his heart with the All-Darkness. And once that's over, Riku unlocks the keyhole within Sora's heart and returns him to the land of the living. There's also a few encounters with memories within Sora's heart, including one with Diz that basically gives Sora a free pass to act like a buffoon in Kingdom Hearts 3, since that's basically where the plot is going anyway. I chuckled a bit listening to it again since Diz made it seem like Sora had superpowers to repair the hearts of others, when it sounded like the only requirement to actually doing that was simply being nice to people. Once Riku and Sora are back in the waking world, the final cutscene sets up what's going to go on in Kingdom Hearts 3, especially with the Organization 13 members now running around as normal people again for good and for ill. Riku has become a Keyblade Master for finishing his quest, while Sora is not. He must go on the same quest again to become the Keyblade Master they need for their group of 7. The Keyblade War is around the corner and everyone needs to be prepared for it. Especially Lee, new member of the Guardians, who's managed to create a Keyblade of his own out of his fire shield. Kingdom Hearts 3 is going to start focusing on that message relayed and recoded, where Sora needs to start fixing the despair of the other Keyblade wielder groups that were lost after their games because of his special powers to do so, along with his heart being stuffed full of random hearts of other characters for a bunch of stupid reasons. And that was essentially what Dream Drop Distance is. A BS quest designed to turn the gears of destiny towards Kingdom Hearts 3. Essentially, a preparation game in purest form. In the end, 3D was unfortunately an underwhelming game. While superior to its portable cousins of old, 3D is still a shorter game, with smaller worlds and little plot development in comparison to the main series that it's attempting to set up for. With the combat system of this franchise having been perfected and the only difference in the later release schedule is to simply add new gimmicks on top of it, the actual combat isn't interesting anymore as it was in the previous entries, meaning that the real difference maker to these games now are their stories, and 3D ends up being in that awkward place between Kingdom Hearts 2 and 3, where Organization 13 is gone, and the story has to start setting up their next villain. But instead of Xehanort heading up 3D and showing us the true threat that's coming to pass, 3D focuses on young Xehanort, who is only the pawn in the game that kickstarts the domino effect of Xehanort's actual plan. It means that the plot of this game ends up feeling like a sideshow to the main event, and portable games really shouldn't end up being like that. 358 really showed us how it's done. It's a self-contained plot using the lowered expectations of the portable game to end up doing something completely unique and unheard of, a chance for the developers to swing for the fences with a bunch of new ideas. And that's what made 358 my favorite game in the series, even though it has really crap gameplay, and it just showed that it was a chance for us to see behind the machinations of Organization 13 and how they managed to pull the strings of Destiny itself, while also being the tragic origin story of Roxas, who is the series' best character. 3D may have well-picked and executed Disney stories that have only been shown with this game, but the overall story is lacking. The central plot is put on the back burner for way too long, and neither of the protagonists seem to care much about their objective up until the final act, which means that most of the game is just unmemorable. The characters should be developing throughout their journey instead of all the development being bookmarked for the ending levels and fights, in order to keep the audience engaged with where the characters are going. It's more likely that we just get to hear Sora and Riku have different versions of the same spiel 4 times, and then everything changes once they hit Nobody's City. The gameplay itself was fast, fluid, and satisfying to knock the colorful enemies around, while the bosses were mostly uninteresting because a lot of them were Dream Eaters, a lot of them were just in drop mini-games. They end up just being the same as the Heartless bosses from previous games. Completely over-designed, completely unmemorable, and then the Disney bosses are just kinda hit and miss, to be honest. Like, the boss fight with the Beagle Boys was, a good idea, but we're fighting the Beagle Boys who don't have a lot of lore around them. And then the baffling decisions to knock out mainstay villains, with the most egregious being Frollo, obviously. Supplanting Frollo with a Dream Eater boss is just the most confusing thing you could ever do. And that just ends up with the combat having fun gimmicks and being good, a fun time to knock shit around and just be a complete badass, flying around the room and having a bunch of options. But since we're fighting unmemorable guys and a bunch of random beasts, it's just something that's really not going to stick in the mind of the people playing. And then on the other hand, most of New Organization 13's members, when you do see them, are simply being walked behind the scenes. They'll taunt the players for a minute and then just leave. And all this does, instead of actively fighting Sora and Riku, their returns are seen as preparatory things for the plot and not worth caring about. So what happens is that they end up removing their own threatening presence from the current story until the end of the game because they're just not being threatening. They're biding their time and showing up when it's most effective for their plan. But then, if you're gonna do that, most of the game ends up feeling like a complete waste of time. Like we're just waiting around until the big denouement happens. Like it's all prescribed beforehand, rather than a more interesting reactive plot happening over time. Everything that happened was expected by the villains. They already knew it was gonna happen, which would work well if that was rolled into the plot and the encounters use that to taunt the players in a completely different way. Having all the cards and really just showing them that they have all the power. But in the end, it just seems like it was a very condensed and badly paced plot, because what happened is all the plot that should have been throughout the game developing over time was just exposition dumped right at the final level and right before the final boss encounter. Simply put, in spite of its better graphics, cutscenes, and gameplay than the DS games, the plot of this game is lackluster and it's paced incredibly badly, making it very difficult for me to care about what the characters are doing and where they are in the plot. The whole fact of the whole thing, it's a game that just feels like it was required from on high to be made in order to set up the plot they had already put together for Kingdom Hearts 3, rather than 3D itself being made as an interesting game to take note of. The developers took the momentum out of this game and supplanted it to Kingdom Hearts 3 so that they could do some wild and crazy things with their new Organization 13, and they didn't leave any events for 3D to do in order to be a worthwhile game in of itself. The whole thing is just a baffling idea and a disappointing release that should have been much better than it actually was. It had the production value, it had late game Square Enix that actually had some talent behind it, and through all of that, it's a video game that just feels like a side quest for a different video game, which just did not work out in its favor one bit. I'll post the scoreboard for this game, and wish you all out there a victory for gamers. Thanks for watching, and tune in next time for the end of this incredibly convoluted plot, and whatever Xehanort could possibly plan to do next.